It's my honour to welcome Dr. Luciella Rose to give the talk today. Luciella is a really good friend of the foundation, and her connection goes back quite some time now, from having looked at the DeMorgans for her PhD research, and then gone on to do what she does today. So I'll introduce Luciella and then let her get on with the talk today. So without further ado, welcome to Victorian Creative Partnerships with Dr. Luciella Rose. Luciella is a lecturer in Victorian Literature at the University of Surrey. She's the author of Suffragist Artists in Partnership, Gender, Word and Image, which was published by Edinburgh University Press in 2018. This book focuses on William and Evelyn DeMorgan and their close friends Mary and George Frederic Watts. Rose works on neglected women in 19th century creative partnerships and is currently working on Sisterhood at the siècle, and presents and publishes on Victorian literature, visual culture and feminisms. So no one better to introduce the DeMorgans to us in the idea of their creative partnerships on their wedding anniversary. Thank you so much, Luciella.
Delighted today to be here to speak on the DeMorgans and the DeMorgans as a creative partnership in context in relation to contemporary creative partnerships. Like those of the Wattses, also the Rossettis, Christina and Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Elizabeth Siddal. So I wanted to kind of present the interconnections of these creative partnerships today. So the DeMorgans' connections to the Wattses' connections to the Rossettis, and show how they were part of this broader creative coterie and circle and intersecting circles of the long 19th century. So happy anniversary to the DeMorgans. I believe it's their 134th wedding anniversary today, so it's a real privilege to be speaking on them today. And I will talk a bit about their marriage. But this is my book, and this is on the DeMorgans and the Wattses, so their interconnected creative partnerships. So I'm just going to pick out today some of their collaborations and their connections, but then also kind of put the feelers out towards their wider circles. So I made this mind map. This is centered on the Wattses, but you can see that the DeMorgans are in there, and how they kind of this is their network basically, with arts and crafts circles, women's suffrage and rights circles, literary circles and pre-Raphaelite circles, and how they all intersect and overlap. So really all of these figures knew each other at the time and were either working together or aware of each other's works and influenced by one another. So the DeMorgans, for example, were very close with the Morris family, with William Morris, Jane and May Morris. And the Rossettis knew everyone. You know, the Wattses were friends with Julia Margaret Cameron, lots of leading feminists. So it's really interesting to me to map these connections. And why would we focus on Victorian creative partnerships? What's the point of that? I think several important things. So a focus on the concept of the creative partnership offers a broader context for and opens up new ways of studying and understanding 19th century writers, their lives, works, views and relationships. It offers a more nuanced understanding of the power relations between the sexes and their reconfigurations, and of the relationship as well between literature and art and culture in the period. It challenges traditional perceptions of the figures themselves, of man who's often seen as the solitary genius and woman as the peripheral muse. So challenging that traditional dynamic. And of the patriarchal Victorian period itself, which was actually this age of transition and transformation, challenging gender history. I think we still, it's often still seen the Victorian period as this period where women were very oppressed, but actually this is the period when women entered en masse for the first time the artistic and literary professions and formed these career enabling partnerships with their husbands and brothers and lots of different people. So it really was a huge boom time for women artists and writers, and a huge period of change. And also studying Victorian partnerships reinterprets what we previously interpreted as straightforwardly patriarchal, so Victorian marital relationships and relationships between men and women in families, and recasting them as sites of creative female agency. So that's what I've tried to map in my own work and hopefully show a bit of today. So this is some examples of some 19th century creative partnerships, split into brothers and sisters in the blue shape there. So like the Bronte sisters, and Branwell Bronte also worked with his sisters, the Rossettis, Charles and Mary Lamb, William and Dorothy Wordsworth, the Pankhurst sisters. And then we have the marital or conjugal creative partnerships in green, so like the DeMorgans, the Wattses, William and Jane Morris, George Eliot and George Henry Lewis, which they weren't actually married, it was a common law marriage. And then groups like the Women of the Yellow Book and the Bloomsbury group, which is, you know, into the 20th century, and the queer partnerships like Michael Field, who were also familiarly related, and Oscar Wilde and Lord Alfred Douglas. So there's a rise, I think, of interest in these creative partnerships. And mid-Victorian women writers and artists were often the daughters, sisters, or wives of writers and artists. So they were often from these creative families, but they were usually brought forth by critics to stand and to be measured up against their male counterparts, basically, and to kind of always measure their failings against their male counterparts. So women were often seen, women artists and writers were often seen as subordinate to their male counterparts, inferior, overshadowed. And for many women, marriage and motherhood were the ultimate impediments to professional careers. Often a professional woman artist or writer who married would then stop her professional art practice or literary practice and just devote herself to marriage and motherhood, maybe because of time constraints or social expectations. But there were some atypical creative partnerships formed between husband and wife, brother and sister, like we're looking at today, that shifted and subverted that traditional balance of power relations between the sexes. And I want to show through looking at the DeMorgans and the Wattses that marriage to a fellow artist or author was actually a career enabling and self-empowering strategy for women. So not only were they marrying like-minded people, but in their husbands practicing art or writing literature, they could work alongside each other and in collaboration sometimes, but in harmony in this kind of household of productivity, artistic productivity. So such creative partnerships between husband and wife or brother or sister, male or female, broke down these binary boundaries between artistic and domestic, public and private, commercial and romantic, capital and kinship, and blurred those binary boundaries that underpinned the Victorian period that was very much obsessed with categories. So I think it's really interesting to look at partnerships because there's a kind of interest, I think, always in looking into people's private lives. But there are also these tantalizing questions about how the workings of these partnerships, how they were organized, how decisions were made, how the daily business of a joint enterprise was undertaken, what exchanges took place in a shared studio between husband and wife. And how did these figures work together? How did they interact and collaborate? Were there any tensions or moments of protest or struggle? And how did these figures work together as individual partnerships, but also as interconnected creative partnerships more broadly? So I'll start with the DeMorgans, who can be seen as a partnership of art and craft, in that Evelyn was predominantly a fine artist and William was predominantly a ceramicist. And that's much like the Wattses, except that Mary was the potter and G.F. Watts was the painter. And the DeMorgans met in 1883, were engaged in 1885 and married in 1887, almost 2 decades after Evelyn first embarked on formal art training. Her sister Sterling recalls that when Evelyn and William first met at a fancy dress ball through mutual friends, they laughed together about art, life, and the eccentricities of humanity, and found in each other the affinity for which they had been waiting. Evelyn, in rose colour, wrote herself down as a tube of rose madder, and William, asked to name his costume, described it as madder still. So they had this joke right from the very beginning at the ball. And in marriage, Evelyn and William are known to have teased each other as schoolboys do, have this kind of banter and this understanding, and were really, really good friends as well as a married couple. And I think their friendship and their sense of humour, that's what their contemporaries name as what brought them together and kept them together, since their temperaments were completely in accordance. Evelyn entered freely into a marriage that allowed her to continue to develop her artistic career. By the time she married, she'd already studied art, exhibited and sold her paintings, developed an independent creative career, and achieved notoriety for her work. Like the Wattses, the DeMorgans represented a revolutionary approach to marital politics as a creative partnership of husband and wife, who enjoyed a harmonious and mutually supportive relationship that facilitated and furthered their artistic endeavours. Unlike many men of the Victorian period, William was fully supportive of his wife's creativity and shared her passion for art. Their concern for the continuation of her career, as well as his, seems to have been a dominant characteristic of their marriage. They bought the lease of a house in Chelsea where leading suffrage campaigners lived, offering a forum of exchange for exchange of ideas. And they built a large studio for Evelyn with the understanding that for a woman to sustain professional art practice after marriage and to produce the kinds of art that she was producing, it was essential that she had an allocated workspace or a room of her own. I've just written a chapter on the DeMorgans suffrage network, and there's some really interesting descriptions of William sitting at these suffrage gatherings, telling ghost stories to a rapt audience in Chelsea. So they were friends with all the artistic coterie in the Chelsea area. A friend of the DeMorgans describes the rejuvenating effect Evelyn had on William, and this is comparable with Mary's effect on George Watts as well. The friend says, "It was the splendid quality of courage and the never say die in Evelyn which revived William's spirits." The same friend calls them two artists of rare and distinguished characters who were indifferent to others' opinions or passing fashions, and claims their home had an atmosphere of cheery restfulness, but that the keynote of this home was work. The DeMorgans' marriage in 1887 was an unconventional wedding for which Evelyn wore red. And this legalised a partnership already made with joint exhibitions of their painting and pottery held in William's showroom at Great Marlborough Street during their engagement. So they already kind of collaborated and presented their artworks alongside each other. Unlike the Wattses, they made no exotic honeymoon plans, but opted for a low-key trip to the Isle of Wight by train. Evelyn consciously postponed marriage and refused to conform to the customs of a Victorian marriage market. Even during her relatively long engagement to William, she declined an engagement ring and wrote to her uncle, "We are only engaged. We should not dream of getting married for at least 15 years. And she actually wanted a runaway wedding to avoid a fuss, according to her sister. So these are some of the press articles on the DeMorgans I wanted to share with you from the British Newspaper Archive. that I think really encapsulate their relationship. And it's always interesting to see how they were viewed by their contemporaries as well. And there's so many contemporary accounts of their marriage. So just going through the bullet points, Evelyn was the presiding genius in the couple, credited with igniting William's sudden literary success. So he enjoyed this second career as a novelist. And it was down to Evelyn that this happened, because she brought him some old scraps of paper that he'd written some kind of draft work on that he'd just thrown away. And she said, you should really do something with this. And then he took it up again and started publishing, and actually became a literary celebrity, and made money from that second career. But this idea that she was the presiding genius challenges the idea of the solitary male genius and the subordinate woman. The second one, English art has not produced many such partnerships as is revealed in the life story of the DeMorgans. So they were one of the famous Victorian celebrity couples of the time, and an unconventional partnership. So I think that's why they were talked about so much as well. And a review of Evelyn's sister Sterling's biography calls it an account of two brave lives, quietly but nonetheless intensely lived. And I also found out from reading this that the DeMorgans' work, one of the exhibitions that was showing both of their works, attracted the Queen. The Queen wanted to come and visit that, so that was reported in 1923. But that's how famous their relationship and their works were. In terms of their collaborations, they collaborated artistically, on spiritual writings, and politically as well in their views. They supported women's suffrage. They were active supporters of women's suffrage, signing women's suffrage petitions, and I'll come on to that in a second. But I wanted to give you some examples of their collaborations. So William's last two novels, The Old Mad House of 1919 and The Old Man's Youth of 1921, were left unfinished on his death and were actually completed by Evelyn. She finished the narrative because the DeMorgans used to sit and talk at length about the plots and characters of his novels. And she obviously influenced a lot of those literary elements of his. But she knew the plots and how they should be played out. So she completed his novels and published them after his death. So there's a kind of literary collaboration there, and a co-authorship as well. And they also in 1909 wrote The Result of an Experiment, which is, they co-wrote that. And it's the product of their spiritualist interests, I guess. So Evelyn was a practicing medium, and this was automatic writing, where supposedly the spirits would write through the hand of the medium and produce spirit messages. So that's what The Result of an Experiment is. It's a collection of spirit writings written through Evelyn, and she would hold the pen or pencil, and William DeMorgan's hand would be on top of hers as well. So a very literal kind of co-authorship there as well. And they're really fascinating as an example of spiritualist writing of the period. Evelyn painted 2 portraits of William as well. And there's lots of, William invented the complex method that he called the process, by which Evelyn painted the soul's prison house. And this process, so it's, artists might know this, might know about this, but the colours were ground in glycerin and spirit, and when the painting was finished, the glycerin was sucked out by a sort of sucked out of the back of the picture basically, and was finished with transparent oil colour. So he was fundamental in kind of her experimentation, her artistic experimentation as well. And there's lots of parallels between their works. So I've put in the mythical sea monsters and reptilian creatures surrounding the female figures in many of Evelyn's paintings, like the dragons in the captives, and the sea serpents in SOS are reminiscent of William's designs on his ceramics. So although the DeMorgans' works are visually disparate in style and media, like one's ceramics, one's fine art, they share sources of inspiration like the Italian Renaissance, and they're complementary in their vibrant colours and their shared themes or motifs, like the sea, mermaids, floral designs, birds and reptilian creatures. Evelyn and William both explicitly depict female alchemists in William's oil painting, The Alchemist's Daughter, and Evelyn's painting, The Love Potion, in a rare association of women and science. And the DeMorgans both painted Tobias and the Angel as well, a decade apart. Williams was in around 1865 and Evelyn in 1875, which suggests their shared interest in these figures and scenes and narratives. So Evelyn and William collaborated, inspired and facilitated each other's visual and literary work in these various ways. And in a fitting fusion of visual and literary, Evelyn's design for William's headstone on his gravestone depicts two figures, grief and joy, and bears an inscription from one of their automatic writings. This one purports to come from an angel, and it says, "Sorrow is only of earth, the life is the spirit. The life of the spirit is joy." So sorrow is only of earth, the life of the spirit is joy. And they are buried in Surrey together. Both the DeMorgans and the Wattses are buried in Surrey, Brookwood Cemetery for the DeMorgans and Watts Chapel Cemetery for the Wattses, where the couples are united in death as in life, being in the same burial plot. This is one of my favourite pictures of the DeMorgans on a gondola. And while the Wattses partnership represented a maybe a more traditional gendering of creative activities, so we have the masculine art, feminine craft dynamic of the Victorian period, in that George was, the fine artist and Mary was the primarily decorative artist. The DeMorgans partnership clearly subverted that traditional binary and its order, in that Evelyn was primarily the fine artist and William was primarily the potter, and that was unusual for the time. William wished to become an artist, a fine artist, and began his career as what he calls a feeble and discursive dabbler in picture making at an old-fashioned art school in 1855, and then at the Royal Academy schools in 1859. But he didn't see himself as a success in this arena. He became disillusioned with the Royal Academy and soon realised his talents were better suited to the decorative rather than the fine arts, in which he had kind of failed and his wife flourished. And he subsequently turned to stained glass and ceramic design in 1861. So the DeMorgans' creative partnership involved what can be seen as an even more radical gender role inversion than that of the Wattses, overtly subverting those traditional power relations between the sexes through professional art practice. Evelyn demonstrated the potential and capability of women to excel in territory previously unexplored because denied to women, and that by transgressing traditionally female domains of the house, that women could break out of the strictures imposed upon them by Victorian society. The more radical gender role inversion wasn't just embodied by the DeMorgans' creative practices, but also by their economic positions, which were obviously linked. Although Mary Watts's professional and commercial activities as a crafts practitioner who established and ran a pottery business gave her some income, she still largely relied on her more famous husband for financial support. But it was Evelyn who worked on commission to sustain her husband's ceramic studio and subsidize his pottery when it was struggling. Evelyn contributed substantial emotional and financial support to William's enterprises, funding his struggling pottery business until its demise in 1907 with her own capital, gained partly from her success as a painter. She was also from a wealthy family, but she was a successful woman artist. William's firm actually relied on Evelyn's large cash injections. So while William was the foremost ceramic artist of the arts and crafts movement in the latter half of the 19th century, whose work won so much artistic acclaim, his ceramic work never provided a large income, and he was financially dependent on Evelyn. Not only did she have more capital than him, but their friends of the time note that she had more business capacity than he. His capacity as a businessman was probably nil, says Sir William Blake Richmond. Similarly, George Watts's complete inability to manage anything like a professional career, despite his fame and success, tested Mary's patience. Evelyn was, in her marriage to William, the kind of principal income generator, and the woman artist was the mainstay of the business in creative partnerships like the DeMorgans, but also Louise Jopling in her marriage to Joseph Jopling, and Joanna Boyce in her artistic partnership with her husband, Henry Tanworth Wells. So the woman artist was the mainstay of the business in these atypical marital partnerships, where the woman appropriated traditionally male privileges. Evelyn was the dominant figure in various ways in the DeMorgans partnership, challenging prevailing power relations and conjugal dynamics of the period. Evelyn's financial success and supremacy was extremely unusual for a woman at the time, when men had economic power, were widely considered the breadwinners, and legally had control over their wife's finances up until the 1870s. Although marriage was widely considered the only means of financial security for most middle-class women in Victorian England, Evelyn was financially successful prior to this union, demonstrating the potential for women to gain financial security independently, as well as to maintain it within marriage and continue a professional art career. So these are the DeMorgans to illustrate that they were a progressive family of artists, writers, intellectuals, and activists. This is William de Morgan on the left, painted by Evelyn de Morgan. That's one of her portraits of him, with his writings and novels in the background, and one of his ceramic pots in his hands. Mary de Morgan in the middle there, who was a suffragist and a philanthropist who worked at a reformatory for Arab women in Cairo, where she died, and ran mothers' classes as well. She also worked at May Morris's embroidery workshop. So she was very much a hub of creativity and forward-thinking people as well. And Sophia de Morgan, William and Mary de Morgan's mother, who was a pioneering feminist. She signed the first mass women's suffrage petition in 1866 and co-founded Bedford College for Women as well. And she was a very, very progressive woman who was a role model not only for William and Mary, but also for Evelyn. And Evelyn became very close to Sophia after her marriage. Sophia left her a clairvoyant crystal, because Sophia was also a practicing medium. And I think Evelyn and Sophia had this understanding as early feminists and spiritualists. So I wanted to show you a timeline of their support as a family for women's suffrage, which I think shows them to be a feminist family, and shows how they influenced one another's support of women's rights in the period. So another kind of collaboration, a political collaboration rather than a creative one. So in 1849, Sophia de Morgan co-founded Bedford College for Ladies in London. In 1866, she signed the first women's suffrage petition, which was presented to Parliament by John Stuart Mill, who was a correspondent of William's father. and was also painted by George Watts for his Hall of Fame. In 1889, Evelyn, Sophia and Mary all signed the declaration in favour of women's suffrage. So it's highly likely that after Evelyn's marriage to William, Sophia and Mary influenced her signatory support of suffrage, and that they all shared these ideas and encouraged each other's ideas. 1897, Evelyn signed a petition sponsored by the Central Committee of the National Society for Women's Suffrage, showing her continued commitment to the cause. In the 1890s, Mary de Morgan joined the Women's Franchise League. In 1909, William signed the Declaration by Men in favour of women's suffrage. And in 1913, William served as Vice President of the Men's League for Women's Suffrage, which was founded in 1907. And around this time, if you look in the press, like the British Newspaper Archive, there are many articles which where he expresses his increasingly impassioned support of women's suffrage, and very, very strongly worded diatribes against Asquith and the government and Parliament, and very much in sympathy with not just suffragists, the peaceful suffragists, but the suffragettes. And he also financially supported the WSPU, which are the militant suffragettes, and publicly expressed his sympathy with them, which would have been very controversial at the time. I think you can see Evelyn's support for suffrage in her works as well, and paintings like The Gilded Cage, The Prisoner, The Captives, SOS, lots of either strong or striving female figures, or figures in captivity in desperate situations, or in some cases like Hope in the Prison of Despair, woman liberating woman. In 1917, William dies. In 1918, the Representation of the People Act enabled women homeowners over 30 to vote. So that was the key year that women won partial suffrage. They didn't win full suffrage until 1928. And in 1919, Evelyn dies. So you can see that, annoyingly, William dies just before women win the suffrage that he campaigned for. And Evelyn lived just long enough to see it. But you can see that they, all of the DeMorgans as a family, joined together in union in their support of women's suffrage. And this is on the right here, Evelyn's headstone for William's grave that I talked about earlier. And on the left here are Felix and Margaret Moschel, who were mourners at William's funeral and listed as such in the press. And they were also a conjugal creative partnership of painters. So that's then another partnership of the period they were obviously friends with the DeMorgans. Yes, I just seen the chat, Jessie Hellman's talking about Mary de Morgan's story, A Toy Princess, is both brilliant and a good description of what was expected from women. And that is a really brilliant story. It's about a princess called Ursula. I'll give you a really quick summary, who is expected to just be silent and compliant by the king and court. And she becomes increasingly silent and oppressed by this situation, even though her spirit is a kind of fighting spirit that doesn't suit that environment. The fairy godmother, because it is a fairy tale for children, or for adolescent girls at least, comes and rescues Ursula and takes her away and replaces Ursula, the princess, with an automaton, a robot, a doll that just speaks, that says a few lines, a few kind of pre-programmed lines. And the king and the court love her. They think that she's beautifully mannered, and they try to make her queen. And then the fairy godmother intervenes and says, oh, well, actually, Princess Ursula, the real one, should take her rightful place. But the king, when given the option, the king and the court choose the doll over the real woman. And the fairy godmother takes the real Ursula away, and she lives a happy life by the sea. But yeah, it's about the expectations of on women by a patriarchal society, and what a patriarchal society, like, you know, the early Victorian period at least, expected of women and chose as attributes in terms of women. So they preferred the robotic replica of the princess to the real thing. So yeah, it's quite a remarkable story actually. Oh yes, and the doll's head falls to the floor and is seen to be empty, yeah. And then it's just repaired, stuck back on, and they make her queen. Yeah, her Mary's short stories and fairy tales are really, there's a lot of socio-political critique and commentary in them to be found. So that's really interesting too. So another partnership of art and craft is G.F. Watts and Mary Seton Watts. And G.F. Watts famously talked about Evelyn as being a long way ahead of all the women and considerably ahead of most of the men. As a pioneering professional woman painter with talent and vision, he saw her as the first woman artist of the day, if not of all time. So a hugely like admiring statement, I think there. And George Watts acted as artistic mentor to Evelyn in her early career, and also gave her the palette knife that I believe is in the DeMorgan collection. So these are the Wattses at their studio home, Limnersley's here, and Watts in older age with Mary reading to him, and the Wattses by the Tennyson statue made by G.F. Watts. And the Wattses as well, similarly to the DeMorgans, were united in their political views as well as their creative pursuits. So this is from Mary's Annals. She says, in talking the matter of women's suffrage over with Signor, I think seriously for the first time, I found that we were agreed and that he believed that feminine influence in politics would have a good effect, especially upon social questions. He recognized the justice of the demand and regarded it as a natural development consequent on the progress of education. This is the Wattses in their niche, where they read all of these authors and more, many, many more. But books on art, Ruskin they read Olive Schreiner, the early feminist. So that's really interesting as an insight into their readings, which influence their artworks and their connections of the period as well. And like the DeMorgans, the Wattses had this productive, supportive, egalitarian relationship, creative partnership. And that's evidenced in Mary's diaries, where she says things like, I grow when I'm with you. I began my work when George did this morning. We had both a hard day of work. George Watts says, how delightful it is to work together in this way. What a sublime life it is for me. But they also had a working relationship where Mary was not afraid to express her opinions on George's art, even though he was a hugely celebrated, world-famous painter of the time. She was confident in her creative views and had formal art training as well. And he often asked her opinions as well. So he says in this, she records this in her diary, are you there? He calls up to my studio sometimes. And then he asked me to come and look at something he's done. Once today, it was to see the oil painting of the little boy Promises. What do you think of it? I said, you've made the wings too real and have lost the dignity of the work. It's more sweet, but less noble. I dare to say what I think. I must, as he is too much in earnest not to wish me to do so. He has lost colour and quality in the wings, and the picture is much damaged by it. An hour afterwards, and he has much restored the quality. So he takes her advice on board and actually revises his paintings in light of her views. And another diary entry illustrating something similar. She says, he calls me in to look at his work. He has got the sky in foreground now to his satisfaction and mine, but I miss and still insist on his trying for the sparkling, clear-cut, iridescent character of the icy peaks, once got but lost long ago at Brighton. Now you've depressed me, he says, and I feel a brutal taskmaster. But I tell him he showed it to me once, so I can't be satisfied with less. The Wattses and the DeMorgans were close friends and collaborators who sympathised with the aims of each other's art and actively supported each other's creative projects. The Wattses' memorial to heroic self-sacrifice in Postman's Park, which was opened in 1900 and it's in central London near St Paul's, was executed by George Watts in collaboration with William de Morgan and was continued by Mary Watts after G.F. Watts's death. George commissioned the production of tiled memorial plaques designed by William for a cloister to commemorate individual acts of heroism in everyday life. As well as being very important to the Wattses, this was itself a remarkable, unique project because unlike war memorials, which honour almost exclusively the deeds of men, this memorial recognises both men and women. The commemoration of self-sacrificing heroines challenged the prevailing belief that women were incapable of physical heroics and prefigured later tributes to suffrage heroism as well. The narration of tragic heroic acts on these decorative tiles not only stands testimony to those who died to save others, but also to the passion, vision and skill of the artists who conceived and created the Wattses and the DeMorgans. Mary also writes in an article that her Surrey kiln was built under the kind supervision of William de Morgan. She apparently realised that she kind of name checks him in an article and realises that William de Morgan's input could kind of benefit her commercial pottery. So she actually does advertise the fact that her kiln was built under William's supervision. And she also consulted William's business partner, Halsey Ralph Ricardo, on her terracotta work. Both William de Morgan and Mary Watts's commercial potteries as well offered craft skills and employment to women and the working classes. So they had a shared vision for how their businesses should run. And both wanted to give women an empowered role in the production process, enabling women to become professional craftswomen. So I wanted to show you some end on, I can see the time, some entries from Mary Watts's diaries on the DeMorgans. So Mary records several visits from the DeMorgans in her diaries when the DeMorgans visited Limnersley's, which offers insight into the interactions and relationships between the two couples. Her earliest mentions suggest that she and George welcomed them as friends into their Surrey studio home and enjoyed their company. She writes, "Later came the DeMorgans. How glad I am we have this gallery and little house." Another entry in the same year implies that Evelyn was privy to the Wattses' deep discussions about morality, society, philanthropy, and spirituality. She writes, and this is the second point on the slide, "Mrs. de Morgan here, our only visitor. Signor lay in the niche and talked of the change that might be wrought for mankind, were he but to realise that his present ideal is all for self-advancement, and chiefly by money, getting for self, and instead was to fix eyes upon the grand universal idea of helping all to reach a happier and better state of things, a heaven might really dawn upon earth." So she was part of these discussions, and I think some of her paintings do envision this kind of better world, a heaven dawning upon earth. Yeah, like the undiscovered country I'm thinking of now. But George talks to Evelyn and Mary while he lays in the niche, which was the Wattses' private reading alcove that I showed a picture of earlier. And that was usually reserved for the evening readings of the Wattses as a couple after visitors had left. The fact that Evelyn's there as well suggests the level of intimacy between the three. Their shared progressive social views and a deep concern about mammonism and the downward descent of the nation in consequence of mammon worship was something they shared. And Evelyn and George both produced works on mammonism. Mary's final diary entry mentioning the DeMorgans reveals their close friendship and mutual admiration of each other's work. She writes, "A nice day of friends. Met the DeMorgans at 9:50. William has become a celebrity as the author of the novel Joseph Vance. After tea, we went to the gallery. The DeMorgans also, I think, loved their day. And when they were leaving, said all that my heart could wish about the shrine I have made for the pictures." The DeMorgans continued to visit Mary at the Watts' Surrey studio home even after George's death, and admired her display of George's work at Watts Gallery. William greatly respected George and wrote to Mary soon after his death in 1904, "My gratitude is great indeed to Signor, both for his art and its teaching." Evelyn's sister also corresponded with Mary. Although there's no evidence that Mary read William's novels, she describes his newfound celebrity status in complimentary detail and is likely to have been aware of the basic plot and characters of Joseph Vance, because it took the novel reading world by storm and contains two of the most nuanced and sympathetic of William's female characters, which would have appealed to Mary. So hopefully I've illustrated the Watts' creative partnership, the DeMorgans creative partnership, and their interconnections as kind of an interconnected creative partnership, creative network. I realise that we are out of time, but I want to quickly show you what I was going to skip through if we had more time. I was going to show you the Watts' relationship to the Rossettis. Watts obviously painted Dante, Gabriel, Rossetti, and did plan to paint Christina Rossetti, but she was too ill. So there's lots of other connections with the Wattses and the Rossettis. And the Rossettis themselves had this creative partnership, but this time it wasn't a marital creative partnership like the Wattses and the DeMorgans. It was between brother and sister, Christina and Dante, Gabriel, Rossetti. And this, the bottom row here is Dante Gabriel Rossetti's illustration for Christina's poetry, his paintings of her in his early Pre-Raphaelite works, using her as a model, and his portraits of her as well, which are a stark contrast, I think you can see, to the art for art's sake, women in decorative interiors on the top row. Christina also wrote poetry about her brother's artwork. And then the other connected Pre-Raphaelite partnership is between Dante Gabriel Rossetti and this time his wife rather than his sister, his wife Elizabeth Siddal, who he draws in artistic. Here she is kind of in the artistic process because she was an artist herself, not just a muse. Although he does also present her as a muse. She features in lots of his famous paintings, but in a kind of more passive way. There's lots of parallels between their works. So here there's Elizabeth Siddal's work on the left, Dante Gabriel Rossetti's work on the right. You can see they're strikingly similar in style. Again here, Elizabeth's on the left, his on the right. You can see the similarities. And this is a collaboration of theirs, The Quest of the Holy Grail. And I was going to end on saying that I think there's a rising interest in creative partnerships as seen by art exhibitions like Pre-Raphaelite Sisters at the MPG. Some of you might remember the Barbican exhibition on modern couples. There's been lots of recent conferences on wives, daughters, mothers, other women behind famous men. Queer British art, which was exploring queer connections and coteries. And lots of publications on sisters, Victorian marriages, and I'm working on sisters now. But I think this is an area of study that's really ripe for further research, and I hope to see that in the future. So thank you for listening, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for that, Luciella. Huge thanks indeed for really illuminating the partnership that the DeMorgans had, but as well allowing us to see that, you know, maybe that kind of partnership wasn't completely unique, and that there were other people in this period who were working and creative together. And I think it's so important to kind of highlight that even though we have that idea about the gender stereotypes of the time, which of course that happened, and it was against that backdrop that these couples emerged, but they did emerge, and there were people who managed to break free from those constraints and go on to have these absolutely sort of superb partnerships where they really encouraged each other to work. And I just, I don't know, but I'm as certain as I can be that the DeMorgans artwork just wouldn't have been what we know it as today had they not become the DeMorgans. So thank you so much for really bringing that to life.